children. She was the only woman standing in the back of the hall, uninvited to sit, while every chair had been claimed by people who once called her friend. Then the timber doors groaned open on frozen hinges, children, and a man the color of winter itself walked in carrying a dead wolf across his shoulders, dropped it at the magistrate's feet and said, "Children, that woman in the back deserves a seat more than any man at this table." Nobody moved. Everything that followed would burn Kettle Falls to its foundations, children. The November wind tearing across the shore of Lake Nipissing in 1887 carried ice crystals that stung like thrown glass. Inside the Kettle Falls Community Hall, children, the annual harvest Thanksgiving feast should have smelled only of roasted goose, boiled turnip, and cedar bough decorations hung from the rough-hewn rafters, children. But for 27-year-old Linnea Aldrich, the hall reeked of something far worse, contempt, children. Linnea stood against the back wall near the wood stove, holding a tin plate she had filled herself from the serving line before anyone could object, children. Her fingers were red and cracked from lye soap and river water, the nails broken short. She wore the same gray wool dress she had worn every Sunday for 5 months, patched twice at the elbows, children, the hem let down as far as the fabric would allow. She ate standing because no one had offered her a chair, children. Not Bridget Macaulay, the mill foreman's wife who had once lent Linnea her best lace collar for a photograph. Not old Père Gagnon, the retired fur trader who had bounced Linnea on his knee as a child. Not even young Estelle Pruitt, the constable's daughter, who had been Linnea's closest companion since they were girls braiding each other's hair beside the rapids, children. Estelle sat between her father, Constable Desmond Pruitt, and Magistrate Virgil Holt at the head table, and she did not look up once. They were punishing Linnea for the sins of a dead man. Her husband, children. Everett Aldrich had been the bookkeeper for the Northern Shield Timber Consortium, the only enterprise that kept Kettle Falls breathing. 5 months ago, in the last week of May, children, Everett had vanished from their cabin on a Tuesday morning, children. He left behind a cold cup of tea, an unmade bed, and a gap of $1,200 in the consortium's payroll ledger. $1,200. Enough to pay 40 lumbermen for a season, children. Enough to collapse the trust of an entire community built on handshake deals and shared hardship. 3 weeks later, children, a Métis trapper named Jean-Luc found Everett's body wedged between granite boulders at the base of Braxton Falls, 7 miles upriver, children. The official inquest, conducted by Magistrate Holt himself, concluded that Everett had attempted to flee north with the stolen wages, lost his footing on the slippery portage trail above the falls, children, and drowned. Case closed. The money was never recovered. Linnea had begged them to listen. Everett would never steal, children. He kept his ledgers in ink so precise you could read them by candlelight from across the room. He alphabetized the spice jars, children. He once walked 2 miles in a blizzard to return 6 cents of overpayment to a general store. But grief makes a poor lawyer, and a young widow with no family name carried no weight against a magistrate's seal. So Linnea stood in the back of the hall, eating cold goose off a tin plate, and tried to make herself as small as the town already believed her to be. The doors opened, children. The wind hit first, a blade of frozen air that guttered every candle on the nearest table and sent napkins swirling off laps. Then came the smell, wood smoke, animal blood, and spruce pitch, children, so thick it was almost visible. And then came the man. He filled the doorframe the way a bear fills the mouth of a den. Cormac Dunne, children. The trappers along the Mattawa River knew his name the way sailors know a reef. Something to respect and steer around, children. He came down from the bush twice a year to sell pelts at Chataine's trading post on the south shore. And each time the town watched him the way you watch a thunderhead rolling across the lake, children. Fascinated and deeply uneasy, He was enormous, dressed in a smoke-darkened caribou hide coat that fell past his knees, his beard a dense black tangle streaked with early gray. His boots were moose-hide, children, laced to the knee with rawhide cord, and they left wet prints on the plank floor as he walked, children. Across his broad shoulders he carried the carcass of a full-grown timber wolf, its yellow eyes still half open, its gray fur matted with frozen blood. He walked directly to the head table, children, where Magistrate Holt sat with a napkin tucked into his collar and a drumstick halfway to his lips, and dropped the wolf on the floor with a heavy, wet thud. "Killed it this morning on the North Ridge," children, Cormac said. His voice was the sound of an axe splitting green wood, deep, unhurried, final, children. "Been taking calves from the Beaulieu farm for 3 weeks. Thought the magistrate might want the proof before he starts another useless inquest." Virgil Holt set down his drumstick slowly, children. His face had gone the color of birch bark. "Mr. Dunne, the hall is reserved for residents of Kettle Falls this evening. I was born 12 miles from here," Cormac said flatly, children. "That's closer than your posting from Kingston." A murmur ran through the tables, children. Cormac's eyes moved across the room, the mill owners, the merchants, the women in their Sunday best clutching their husbands' arms. His gaze stopped at the back wall. He saw Linnea. He saw the tin plate, children, the gray dress, the empty space around her, as deliberate as a quarantine line. Without a word, Cormac turned his back on the magistrate, stepped over the dead wolf, and walked the length of the hall, children. His boots were impossibly loud in the silence, children. Bridget Macaulay pulled her daughter onto her lap to make room, though Cormac was nowhere near her bench. Père Gagnon blessed himself under his breath. Cormac stopped 3 feet from Linnea. Up close, children, he smelled like the deep bush, balsam fir, tanned leather, cold granite, and the iron tang of fresh blood from the wolf. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, set deep beneath a heavy brow, children. They held no pity, they held recognition, children. "That woman in the back deserves a seat more than any man at this table," he said loud enough for the room to hear. Then, quieter, only to her, "Sit down, Mrs. Aldrich, I'll stand, children." He pulled a bench from against the wall and set it at the end of the nearest table, ignoring the horrified stares of the Beaulieu family already seated there. He gestured for Linnea to sit. Her throat closed, children. Her hands shook so badly the fork rattled against the tin plate, children. "You don't want to do this," she whispered. "They'll turn on you too." Cormac shrugged, a motion that involved his entire massive frame, children. "I've wintered alone on the Mattawa, with nothing but a dog and a half-bag of pemmican. I think I can survive a few dirty looks." Linnea sat, children. Cormac stood beside her like a stone breakwall and ate roast goose with his bare hands, tearing the meat off the bone with his teeth, staring down anyone who looked sideways at the woman beside him, children. For the first time since Everett's death, Linnea finished a meal in a room full of people without her stomach turning to acid. Nobody spoke to her, but nobody whispered either, children. They were too busy watching the trapper. The morning after the feast, Linnea woke to a sound she couldn't place, a rhythmic, heavy thudding from outside her cabin, children. She pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders and pushed open the door, wincing against the cold, children. Cormac Dunne was splitting birch rounds on her chopping block. He had already stacked a quarter cord against the east wall. Beside the woodpile, children. Hanging from the skinning rack Everett had built 2 summers ago, was a dressed white-tailed doe, the meat bright red in the gray morning light. "Morning," Cormac said without looking up, children. He buried the axe in the block and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Mr. Dunne." Linnea stepped onto the porch, her bare feet burning on the frost-covered boards. "Children." "What are you doing?" "Noticed your woodpile last night when I passed. You're a week from freezing if the lake-effect storms come early. And they will. I can split my own wood. I saw the blisters on your palms at the hall, he said, finally looking at her. You can, and you have been, but today you don't have to. Linnea wanted to argue. Pride was the only currency she had left, and she spent it carefully, children. But the birch was already split, the dough was already hanging, and the man was already turning back toward the tree line, where a massive bay draft horse stood tethered, its breath steaming in the still air. Wait, she called. At least come in for tea. The kettle's still warm. Cormac paused. Then he nodded once and followed her inside. The cabin was barely 12 feet square, children. A cast-iron stove, a rope-frame bed, a pine table with 2 chairs, and a shelf of books that Everett had ordered from a catalogue in Montreal, children. Cormac had to duck through the doorway, and even then his shoulders nearly brushed both sides. He sat carefully in Everett's chair, and the wood groaned under him. Linnea poured black tea into 2 enamel mugs, children. The silence between them was thick but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of the bush, which Cormac wore like a second skin, children. Why did you come to the hall last night? She asked, setting his mug on the table. You've never come to a town gathering before. I had a wolf to deliver. You could have left it at Holt's office, children. Cormac wrapped both hands around the mug. His knuckles were scarred, his fingers thick as axe handles. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. I heard what they did to you, Linnea, children. Up in the bush, news travels slow, but it travels. I knew Everett. Her breath caught, children. You knew my husband? He bought pelts from me twice. Honest man. Counted every coin in front of me, wrote a receipt in that careful hand of his, and thanked me like I was doing him the favor. Cormac paused. Children. A man like that doesn't steal $1,200 and run into the bush in May with no provisions and no canoe. That story never sat right with me. Before Linnea could respond, children. The sound of hooves on frozen ground broke the silence. She moved to the window. Children. Through the frost patterns on the glass, she saw Constable Desmond Pruitt dismounting from his chestnut mare, his brass badge catching the weak morning sun. Stay inside, Linnea said quickly. Please, I don't want you caught up in this. I'm already here, Cormac said. He didn't move from the chair. Linnea pulled her shawl tight and stepped onto the porch. Children. Pruitt was already halfway up the path, his long wool coat unbuttoned despite the cold, one hand resting on the holstered revolver at his hip. He was a lean man with a narrow, children, handsome face and pale eyes that never quite settled on anything. Linnea, Pruitt's voice was clipped. I've had 3 complaints this morning about your conduct at last night's gathering. My conduct, children. I stood in the back and ate cold goose. What conduct? You brought that animal Dunne into the hall, children. You made a spectacle. Mr. Dunne walked in on his own. I didn't invite him. Pruitt's eyes flicked to the fresh woodpile, then to the hanging deer. His jaw tightened. Linnea, you need to understand your position. This town has been generous in not pressing charges against you for Everett's debts. Magistrate Holt has held that order of leniency at my personal request, children. But if you begin associating with men like Dunne, men who have no respect for law or civil society, I cannot guarantee that generosity continues. Generosity? The word tasted like rust, children. You call this generosity, Desmond? I can't buy flour at Chautain's without Bridget McAuley counting my coins to make sure they're not stolen. Estelle, your own daughter, won't look at me, children. I teach no children because no mother will send them to a thief's widow, children. Your generosity is a leash. Pruitt's pale eyes went flat. Mind your tongue. You owe this town a debt your husband left behind. I suggest you pay it in silence. She doesn't owe anyone a damn thing, children. Cormac filled the cabin doorway behind her, the enamel mug still in his hand, steam rising past his beard. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of falling timber. Children. Pruitt's hand tightened on his revolver. Done. You're trespassing on posted property. Mrs. Aldrich's property. Children. She invited me for tea. You, on the other hand, are standing in her yard without asking. The two men locked eyes. Pruitt was tall, but Cormac was taller, wider, and utterly still in the way that large animals are still before they move very fast. Pruitt broke first. He stepped back toward his horse, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. "You're making a mistake," Pruitt said to Linnea. Children. "Both of you are." He mounted his mare, yanked the reins hard enough to make the animal toss its head, and rode south toward town without looking back. Children. Linnea gripped the porch railing until her knuckles whitened. "He'll make trouble. He already has." Cormac set the mug on the railing and reached inside his coat. Children. He pulled out a folded piece of oilcloth and unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay two objects, a small deformed lead ball and a torn sheet of paper covered in neat, precise handwriting. Children. "I found these in June," Cormac said, his voice dropping low, "at the top of Braxton Falls, on the portage trail where they say Everett slipped. The bullet was buried in the trunk of a white pine, 6 feet up." Children. "Directly above the bloodstain on the rocks. Whoever fired it was standing behind him." Linnea stared at the bullet. The world tilted. "Everett didn't slip," she whispered. "No." Children. Cormac placed the paper in her hand, and he didn't steal. Children. "I found this in a birch bark cache wedged under a root ball, about 40 yards from where he fell. Looks like he hid it before they caught him." Linnea unfolded the page. Children. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Everett's meticulous script. Each letter formed with the care of a man who believed numbers and words were sacred things. Children. It was a page torn from the Northern Shield Timber Consortium ledger. The final entry read, May 19th, transfer of payroll funds $2,200, authorized by V. Children. Holt and D. Pruitt, diverted to private account, Pruitt and Holt, Bank of Upper Canada, North Bay branch. The paper shook in her hands. Children. A sound came out of her throat that was not quite a scream and not quite a laugh. The raw, terrible noise of a woman discovering that the world is exactly as cruel as she feared. Children. And also that her husband died honest. "They killed him," Linnea said. The words felt like swallowing broken glass. Holt and Pruitt. Children. "They stole the money and they killed Everett to cover it. And then they let you carry the shame," Cormac said. His dark eyes held a fury that was banked like coals beneath ash, patient, enduring, and very, very hot. "They've been living clean on a dead man's name for 5 months. Linnea pressed the ledger page against her chest and wept. Children. Not the thin, quiet weeping she had taught herself in the months since the funeral. The kind you do silently, so the neighbors won't hear, and add it to the list of reasons to pity you. This was deep. Children. Ragged sobbing that came from a place she had bricked shut. She cried for Everett's careful handwriting, and his alphabetized spice jars, and the way he said her name in the morning. Children. Drawing out the second syllable like it was a note in a song. Children. She cried for the 6 months she had spent hating herself for loving a man the town called a thief, and for the relief, God help her, the shameful. Children. Soaring relief of knowing he had been exactly who she believed him to be. Cormac did not touch her. He stood on the porch with his hands at his sides and waited the way you wait for a storm to pass. Children. Without hurrying it, without fearing it, with the simple understanding that it must be endured. Children. When the sobbing finally slowed, Linnea wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up at him. "What do we do?" Pruitt controls the constables from here to Mattawa. Holt controls the circuit court. Going to either of them is walking into a trap. We need to reach Inspector Fallon of the Northwest Mounted Police in Ottawa. He operates outside their jurisdiction. Children. If we can put this ledger page in his hands, Holt and Pruitt will hang. Ottawa is 300 miles through the bush in November. "I know the portage routes," Cormac said. "But we have a bigger problem. Pruitt saw the woodpile. He knows I've been around. Once he talks to Holt, they'll figure out I found the evidence. They will come tonight, Linnea. We need to leave before dark. The cabin felt impossibly small. Children. Linnea looked at the shelf of books, at the rope-frame bed she had shared with Everett, at the cast-iron stove that had been their only warmth. Children. She was being asked to leave the last physical trace of her marriage and walk into the northern Ontario wilderness in November with a man she barely knew. Children. She took Everett's hunting knife from its hook above the door, wrapped the ledger page in oilcloth, and tucked both inside her coat. "I'll need 10 minutes," she said. Children. They were on the water by late afternoon, Cormac's birch-bark canoe, cutting through the gray chop of Lake Nipissing, heading east toward the mouth of the Mattawa River. Children. Linnea sat in the bow with a paddle she hadn't held since childhood, her arms burning within the first mile. Behind her, Cormac drove the canoe forward with long, children. Silent strokes that barely rippled the surface. The first sign of pursuit came at dusk. Children. As they rounded the granite point at the eastern narrows, Linnea heard it, the distant, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot echoing across the water. She turned and saw, far behind them on the darkening lake, children, the orange glow of torches moving along the shore near her cabin. "They're burning it," she said. Her voice was hollow. Cormac didn't stop paddling. "Don't look," he said. "The fire's behind us, children. Everything ahead of us is yours." She looked anyway. Children. The glow grew until it was a small, bright wound on the black shoreline, and she watched her cabin, her books, her marriage, her shame, all of it curl into smoke and drift up into the November stars. Then she turned forward and paddled harder. For 4 days they pushed east along the Mattawa River, portaging around rapids that roared with the weight of autumn rain. Children. The terrain was relentless. Canadian shield granite, slick with ice, rising and falling in bald domes between stands of black spruce, so dense the sunlight barely reached the ground. Cormac moved through it the way water moves through a stream, finding the path of least resistance without seeming to think about it. Children. He caught brook trout in the eddies below the rapids, built fires so small and smokeless they could only be seen from 10 feet away, and always gave Linnea the warmer spot near the coals. On the 4th night, a storm rolled in from the northwest. Not snow yet, but an ice rain that coated every branch and rock in a glaze that glittered like shattered crystal in the firelight. Children. They took shelter in a shallow granite overhang above the river, the kind of place Cormac called a bush hotel. Barely deep enough to block the wind, but dry. Linnea sat with her back against the rock. Children. Wrapped in a Hudson's Bay blanket, watching Cormac feed small sticks into the fire one by one. The rain hissed on the granite above them. The river roared below. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Children. The question had been sitting in her throat for 4 days. Children. "You could have left the bullet and the paper on my porch and disappeared. You owe me nothing. You barely knew Everett." Cormac was quiet for a long time. The fire cracked. A loon called somewhere downriver. Children. Its voice the loneliest sound in the northern night. "I've been in this bush for 11 years, he said finally. "I left Peterborough after my mother died because I couldn't stand the noise. Not the sound, children. The noise, people talking and never saying anything, children. Smiling and meaning nothing by it. I came north because the bush is honest. A storm is a storm, a wolf is a wolf. Nothing pretends to be something it isn't." He set another stick on the fire. "But living alone doesn't make you stop caring about right and wrong. It just makes you see it clearer, because there's nothing else in the way." He looked at her, and in the firelight his dark eyes held a warmth she hadn't expected. "Children. I sat at your table at the feast because it was the only honest place in the room. Every other seat in that hall was surrounded by people who knew the truth or suspected it. and chose comfort over decency. You were standing alone with nothing but your own spine holding you up. I've met grizzlies with less courage. Linnea felt something crack open in her chest. Not the grief, children. Something older, something she had sealed shut the day she decided that needing anyone was a luxury she could not afford. She reached out and rested her hand on his forearm. Children. The muscle beneath the caribou hide was like braided rope. They won't stop coming, she said. Let them come. Cormac covered her hand with his. His palm was rough as bark and warm as a hearthstone. Children. A bull moose is most dangerous when it's cornered in a river. We reached the telegraph office in Mattawa by Thursday. Children. One wire to Ottawa. This ends. But the storm delayed them. The ice rain turned to heavy, wet snow overnight, and by morning the portage trail above the next set of rapids was a treacherous sheet of glass. They lost half a day hauling the canoe over a granite ridge that should have taken an hour. Children. And when they finally reached the high bluff above the narrows where the Mattawa River bent south, a rifle shot split the frozen air and punched a hole through the bow of the canoe. Children. 6 inches from Linnea's hand. Cormac moved faster than any man his size should have been able to. He seized Linnea around the waist and threw them both behind a massive toppled white pine. Children. Its root ball providing a wall of frozen earth and stone. Children. A second shot cracked into the trunk above their heads, showering them with splinters and ice. Down the slope, Cormac hissed. Children. He had his rifle unslung and cocked before Linnea's heart had finished its first panicked beat. He peered over the root ball. 3 men were working their way up the slope from the river. Children. Constable Pruitt in front, his revolver drawn, and behind him 2 men Linnea recognized from the logging camp. Hired muscle, rough men who worked for whoever paid. Children. There was no sign of Magistrate Holt, too careful to dirty his own hands. Give it up, Dunne. Pruitt's voice rang off the granite. Hand over the woman and whatever papers you've been waving around, and I'll see you get a clean hanging instead of a bullet in the back. More courtesy than some deserve. He's panicking, Cormac murmured, checking his rifle. Children. He knows once we reach Mattawa, he's finished. He pulled Everett's hunting knife from Linnea's belt and pressed it into her palm, then drew his own sidearm. Children. A heavy revolver that looked older than Confederation, and placed it in her other hand. If I fall, you run south along the ridge. Mattawa is 8 miles. Don't stop for anything. Children. I am not leaving you on this rock, Linnea said. Her voice shook, but her grip on the revolver did not. Children. The woman who had stood silent in the back of the hall, who had eaten cold goose off a tin plate and told herself that smallness was safety, that woman was gone. She had burned with the cabin. Children. Cormac looked at her. A slow, fierce smile broke through his beard, transforming his face. Then stay low and stay loud. Cormac rose from behind the root ball and fired twice. Children. One of the hired men yelped and dropped his rifle, clutching his thigh, and fell sideways into the snow. Children. The other dove behind a spruce trunk. Colton! Linnea screamed, using the young hired man's name. She stood up from behind the pine, ignoring Cormac's snarled warning. Colton Beaulieu, children. Do you know why you're here? Do you know what Pruitt did? The second hired man, barely 20, peered around the spruce with wide, terrified eyes. He murdered my husband, children. Linnea's voice tore across the frozen ravine like a blade. Everett found out that Pruitt and Holt stole the payroll, children. $1,200. They shot him in the back at Braxton Falls and called it an accident. We have the ledger page in Everett's own handwriting. Every dollar accounted for, every name listed, children. You want to die protecting a thief and a murderer, Colton. Your father works for the consortium. That was his wages they stole, Colton. Beaulieu lowered his rifle. Shut your mouth and shoot, children. Pruitt swung his revolver toward the young man, children. No. Colton dropped the rifle in the snow and raised his hands. My father nearly lost the farm because of that missing payroll. If what she's saying is true, I'm done. Pruitt's face contorted. Children. Stripped of his authority, cornered by truth, he did the only thing a desperate man with a gun and no conscience does. He aimed at Linnea. The shot came from behind the root ball. Cormac's rifle roared. Children. The bullet struck Pruitt's shoulder and spun him half around. Children. His boots, polished leather, wholly unsuited to the northern bush, skidded on the ice-glazed granite. For one terrible suspended moment, Pruitt stood on the edge of the bluff, his arms wheeling, his pale eyes wide with the sudden animal understanding that the ground was no longer beneath him. He fell, children. Not far, not dramatically, but with a sickening crunch onto the rocks at the river's edge, 15 feet below, where he lay screaming and clutching his broken leg, children. His revolver lost somewhere in the churning gray water. The silence that followed was so complete that Linnea could hear the individual snowflakes landing on her coat. Colton Beaulieu knelt in the snow, children. Shaking, the other hired man was curled on his side, groaning, holding his thigh, children. Pruitt's screams echoed off the granite walls of the ravine, raw and animal. Cormac lowered his rifle. He looked at Linnea, his chest heaving, children. His dark eyes bright with something that was not triumph, but something close to wonder. She didn't think. She crossed the space between them and pressed her face into his chest, children. Her fingers gripping the caribou hide, breathing in the smell of gunpowder and balsam and the cold, honest north, children. His arms came around her, and for a moment, in the falling snow on a frozen bluff above the Mattawa River, the world was very small and very still and very safe. "It's over," Cormac said into her hair, children, his voice barely a breath. "Not yet," Linnea whispered, "but almost." They reached Mattawa that evening, children. Colton Beaulieu carried his wounded companion on his back for the last 3 miles and gave a full statement to the telegraph operator, who wired Inspector Phelan in Ottawa before sundown, children. Pruitt was found alive on the rocks by a Métis fishing party the next morning, delirious with pain and cold. He was brought to Mattawa in the back of a freight canoe and placed under guard. 10 days later, Inspector Fallon arrived in Kettle Falls with 4 mounted police constables. Magistrate Virgil Holt was arrested in his office above the general store. He did not weep. He did not rage, children. He simply sat in his leather chair, staring at the wall as the iron cuffs closed around his wrists, a man who had finally run out of verdicts. The stolen wages were recovered from a strongbox buried beneath the floor of Holt's root cellar, every dollar accounted for, exactly as Everett had recorded. Everett Aldrich's name was cleared, children. The circuit court issued a formal letter of exoneration, and it was read aloud in the Kettle Falls Community Hall on a Sunday morning in December, children, to a congregation that sat in silence and would not meet each other's eyes. They came to Linnea afterward. Bridget Macaulay with a basket of preserves, Père Gagnon with tears in his rheumy eyes, children. Estelle Pruitt, pale and hollow, carrying a bouquet of dried wildflowers, and an apology that sounded like it had been rehearsed in a mirror for days, children. They came to the ruins of her cabin, to the blackened foundation stones and the ash-covered clearing, and they found nothing. Linnea was gone. 60 miles north, children, where the Mattawa River narrowed to a creek between walls of ancient spruce, smoke curled from the chimney of a new cabin built with green logs and roofed with birch bark, children. The lake in front of it was frozen solid, and the tracks of a snowshoe hare stitched across the ice in the thin December sunlight. Children. Linnea stepped out onto the porch, pulling a heavy fur-lined parka around her shoulders. The cold was immense and clean, children, the kind of cold that burns your lungs and makes your eyes water and reminds you with every breath that you are spectacularly, undeniably alive. Down the trail, Cormac emerged from the tree line, children, his bay draft horse plodding behind him, the sled loaded with supplies from his autumn trapline. He saw her on the porch and raised one massive hand. Linnea raised hers. Children. She was not a pariah. She was not a widow draped in someone else's shame. She was a woman standing on her own porch, in her own country, breathing air that owed nothing to anyone. Children. She was sitting at a table she had built with her own blistered hands, across from a man who had chosen the only honest seat in the room, and found that it was hers. Children. The smoke rose straight and white into the still northern sky, and the lake held the silence like a secret it intended to keep.